Alright, in this video we are going to cover the differences between the factory, provider, and the service in AngularJS. And the spoiler is that they're actually all the same. Factory and service are just special cases of the provider. And I'm going to show you that example by example. So here in front of us we have the basic code setup for a basic Angular app. So we're including the AngularJS library, we're including our app.js file. We have a module and we have a controller, all defined here, none of them doing anything special at the moment. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to use a provider. The providers do as the name implies, which is that they provide values. So in this case, we're going to provide a string value called myValue. Module, provider, name of my provider, and the function behind it. The provider has one method defined in it, which is get. Well, it can have multiple methods, but the one that actually gets called by Angular is get. So we assign a function here, and whatever get returns is the value that we get. So in this case, it's going to be my value. We're going to inject this into our controller, and we're going to display it in the console output, the value that we get. So we have that, we run it, and as you can see in the console window, the output is my provider, my value. So that worked. We're able to use a provider to return a value and inject that into our method. Now, one important thing to note, and this is true for all the providers, as we mentioned, they're all the same. Factory and service are also providers, so it applies to all of them, is that no matter how many times you inject the provider, the value only gets executed once. So the get method in this case will only execute once, no matter how many times we inject it. And I'm going to show you that by creating another controller. So this will be my controller 2. And that one's also going to output my provider. And I'm also going to add a console.log statement inside the get method. My provider get called. So now in the HTML, I am going to add another div with another controller, in this case, my controller 2. Let me save that. Let me go back. Let me refresh. And as you can see, we have two output messages of my provider, both displaying the value my value. So that's one for each controller. And you can see my provider that get only got called once. So that's very important. The first time a provider gets injected, Angular executes it, calls get, and then stores and remembers that value. Every subsequent time that the provider gets injected, it just returns the value that it extracted the first time. So to show you how they're different, right? So this was our provider, or correction, how they're the same. This is a provider. Now I'm going to go and create a factory. So I'm going to take this. I am going to copy it. I'm going to comment it out so you have it for reference. And I'm going to change it to a factory. So obviously instead of provider, I am going to do factory. And essentially what factory does is that if you can see our provider in this example above, you can see that we're writing all this code, but at the end of the day, the only part that's unique is this function. Why assign this function to get? Why not just give Angular the function itself? Which is exactly what we're going to do here. We're going to erase all this portion, and we're just going to use this portion, right? Because that's the only part that's really unique. So we have our function. It does all the same things. It returns a value. Nothing else has changed. I'm going to save this. I'm going to run it. And you can see we get the same exact results. So, and you can see here side by side for comparison, the provider assigns a function to the get method. The factory just provides the function itself. It doesn't have to assign it to anything. So as you can see, they're both doing exactly the same thing. Factory does it in slightly less code. Now, in this case, we're returning a string, but in many cases, what we actually want to return is actually an object. But as you can imagine, that's not very different from what you're seeing here. Instead of returning a string, we can return an object. Now, in JavaScript itself, there are several different ways that you can create an object. We are going to use the method called the function, the object constructor, or the object function. And we're going to define a function that describes our object. So here we have our object, and in here we're going to create a method in our object called getValue, and that method is going to return my object value. So now, instead of returning the string my value, we're going to return a new instance of my object. Now, keep in mind, before we were returning a string, so my provider was literally the value returned by getValue, which was a string. In this case, it's returning an object. So what we want to do in our case is we want to call the function getValue on our object. So here we go, getValue. I'm going to add a getValue to the second controller as well. And we are going to save this. We're going to go back and refresh. And as you can see, again, still true. The get only ever gets called once. When in this case, it isn't the get, right? This is our factory method, right? So let's just change this. Function, factory function call, right? So our factory function got called only once. The same object was passed back each time. When we call the get value, we are getting the return value of get value from our function. All right, so we can return any kind of value, including an object. Now, this is going to lead us into the difference and the similarities between factory and service. So in this case, we have a function that we're using, an object constructor. Now, we're only using it in one place. We're only instantiating this once ever, which means what we could do is we don't have to define this as a function with a name. Instead, we can just take the function and call it right in the spot. So we'll change the syntax here a little bit. These all mean the same thing. If we did, for example, function my object equals function, this is the same exact thing as before, just a different way of writing it. So what we're saying is, since we're assigning this here and it's only being used once, we can just take this function and put it in place of that spot, right? So now we are returning a new instance of it calling this function, and we don't have to declare it at all. So we just essentially inlined the function. So if we go back, again, the same results are exactly the same because all we did, this is just JavaScript specific, not Angular, is just we inlined the object function that we're using to instantiate and describe the object. So this allows us to go right into the service because, again, before, if we saw for the provider, it was defining a function for the get method. And we thought, okay, well, why can't we just pass the function to it? And that's exactly what a factory is. You just pass that function instead of having to assign it to the get method. Well, it turns out the difference is very similar between factory and service. So again, I'm going to take this, I'm going to copy it, and then I'm going to comment it out so that we have it here for reference. And I'm going to paste a new one, and this time I'm going to change it into a service. The service is similar. So you see factory, we were returning a new instance of a function, but why can't we just return the function and let it handle the other portion? So we change this to a service, and we take out all this additional code and just leave the object function. So you can see before we were returning a new function, and that function was defining the get value function for that object. In this case, we're just returning that body. We're just returning the contents of this function, or correction, this function itself. We're going to use just that. And as you can see, it's less code than the one before. So now we have our service. We are going to save this. We're going to run this. And as you can see, we get the same results. We don't have a place to call console.log anymore, so you don't see that in here. In fact, actually, what if we do that right here? All right, there we go. So we did the same thing, and we see we're getting the same results. So each one essentially lets you do the same thing with less code. So that covers the service. Now the question becomes, when do you use which one, right? If the service is less code than the factory and the factory is less code than the provider, then why wouldn't you always use a service? And the answer is you can't always do the same things in all of them. So I'll give you an example. So we have a service, right? So if you wanted to return a value instead of an object, you can't use a service, right? You would have to use a factory, because the factory, what it lets you do the same thing as a service, it lets you do more than a service can do. A service returns and instantiates an object. A factory can return any kind of value. So that's one reason. The other thing that's a difference is the provider gives you access during configuration time. And I'll show you what I mean. So here we have the service. We're going to take this out, comment this out again, and we will put the provider back in. All right, now because we're not using an object, we get rid of the call to get value from our controllers. And we're here again. All right, so you can, as I mentioned, alluded to it earlier, you can add additional functions to your provider. At the end of the day, when you get injected, only get gets called, but you can access any additional functions during your configuration phase. In this case, we have a get method. It returns a value called myValue. But what if we wanted that to be configurable? Then we can create a function called setValue that provides a new value. We can store the value that we're going to return. So by default, it will be myValue. But we can change that value to new value. And then instead of returning a string literal constant, we are going to return the value that has been configured. So if we save this and we run this, we get the same results we originally did with the provider. But now, if we want it during the configuration phase, we can change that value. So here we have our function. Now, one caveat: to configure the provider, you have to add a suffix to it called provider. That's to get the provider itself, as opposed to getting the value that the provider provides. So here we have my provider. And now we are able to access those additional functions. So in this case, we'll call set value, new value. Let's save that. Let's run it. And as you can see now, it says new value instead of saying my value. So that's one additional difference between the provider and the factory and the service, is that the provider can be accessed during the configuration phase. Now, another example of a case where you would want to use one over the other is in the case, let's say, the factory, right? In this case, we're defining our own object. But what if we were trying to return an object that was defined somewhere else, and we couldn't change it, and we wanted to pass a construction argument to our object? There's no way to pass constructor arguments to a service. Let's say, for example, we have a person, right? And it takes a name as part of its constructor argument, and that's how it assigns the value. So in order to pass it the value name, we have to call it that way, right? So we have our factory here. Let's uncomment that. And we're going to return a new instance of person. Right, so now we're returning person, and we're going to display the name of that person. But as you can see here, let's first confirm that that works. That does not work. Not sure why. Let me see what this error is. Set value is not a function, right? I forgot to get rid of the configuration code because we're no longer using that provider in that example. We're using the factory. All right, so I removed that. It's running again. You can see it displays the name John. Now, you can see when I instantiate the instance of the person class that I pass it a constructor arguments. There's no way to do that in service. So if you needed to do that, you would use a factory instead of a service. So there's some things that each one can't do, which answers the question of why don't you always just use service? And it's because not in all cases can you. If you're assigning, if you want to be able to call methods on the provider to configure it in some ways during the configuration phase, then you have to use the provider. You can't use factory and you can't use service. If you want to instantiate an object and pass it constructed arguments, you can't use service. You would have to use factory. Now, we've covered three, right? We mentioned that it was provider, factory, and service, but there are actually more. And the differences are similar, right? Again, at the end of the day, they're all providers, but you use some for special cases. One of the other providers is called value. So if you remember before, we had the provider and we had the factory where all we did was return a literal value, like my value. So if we are going to do that, again, we have the special case that instead of writing a factory with a return method, we can actually just define the value itself. So module value, my provider, and the value is my value. Let's get rid of the .name because we're not returning an object anymore. And in this case, we're going to run this. As you can see, we get my value gets returned. So again, value is a special case of factory. If your factory or your provider, all is doing is returning a literal value, then you can use value instead of using a factory or service. Each one of these essentially lets you write the same thing in less code. Now, there's an additional one that's similar to value called constant. And if you look at it at the high level and you run it, it's exactly the same. The difference for constant is that you can only assign it once. So every time you try to assign it after that, it actually doesn't do anything. It just stores the value one initial time. Also, the constant can be accessed during the configuration phase. The value cannot. Now, again, talking about the differences, if your factory is returning when to use it, right? When would you use a factory to return a value? And the answer is if you're going to do some kind of calculation. Or you're going to go out and reach out to a server to get a piece of data to then calculate the value. Would be the difference because you can't do that with a value or constant. You can only define the value itself. So again, that's the difference between some of them. In some cases, you use the one that does whatever you want in the least amount of code. But in some cases, it's not going to be able to do what you want, and in which case you use one of the other providers that does let you do that. Now, I have a quick reference on my blog. So it'll be simply good code where I wrote about this. So if you want a reference, I'll include it in the notes of this video. You can go to the post that I have, the difference between service provider and factory in AngularJS, where I cover in more detail a lot of the stuff that we already talked about. There also be JS Fiddles examples, so you can actually play with some of the examples that I mentioned. And there's a quick reference at the bottom if you need, as a quick reminder, kind of a cheat sheet about which one to use and when to use it. So you can see we have all the things that we cover: constant, factory, provider, service. There's also this graphic to illustrate to you and show you how a provider is actually, the broader case of factory and value, which also should work as a quick reference if you need to remember all this stuff. If you like the video, please mark it so. Subscribe for more videos. There's an email course on my blog that I'm working to put together. And there's a reference guide there, which the link to that will be in the video below. Thank you for watching. Bye.